The emergency room at Harlow General Medical Center in Raleigh, North Carolina stopped breathing the moment the black SUVs screamed into the ambulance bay. 3 of them, back to back, doors flying open before the vehicles even stopped. Men in tactical gear poured out with a stretcher between them, a soldier soaked in blood from collar to boot, and one of them, a woman with a colonel's insignia on her sleeve, grabbed the first person she saw in scrubs and shoved a photograph in their face. "Where is she? Where is Nurse Mara Voss?" Nobody moved, because nobody knew who that was. Jalmon, before you go any further, if you're watching this story unfold and feeling that pull in your chest right now, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Stories like this one don't come around often, and you do not want to walk in halfway through. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened that night in Raleigh, you have to understand the woman nobody thought to look at twice. Mara Voss had a habit of arriving to her shift 11 minutes early. Not 10, not 15, 11, which was specific enough that the overnight charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Desmond Price, had started setting his personal watch by her footsteps in the hallway. She came in through the side entrance off the parking structure, always carrying the same battered canvas tote bag, always with her dark hair already pinned back, always without coffee because she'd stopped drinking it sometime around her 32nd birthday and never went back. She was 36 now. The tote bag had a small tear along the left seam that she'd repaired twice with electrical tape. These were the things Desmond knew about her. These were the things most of the staff at Harlow General knew about her, which was to say, almost nothing. She worked the trauma bay on the night rotation, Tuesday through Saturday, and she was good at it in the way that people are good at things they've been doing so long they no longer have to think about it. Her vitals assessments were fast. Her IV placements were clean. She anticipated things before residents called for them, which annoyed the newer doctors and made the experienced ones quietly grateful, though none of them ever said so out loud. She was not a surgeon, she was not a physician, she was a nurse, and in the specific ecosystem of Harlow General's trauma department, that meant she was part of the furniture, necessary, reliable, and largely invisible. Dr. Preston Gage, the department's chief of trauma surgery, noticed her exactly once in the 3 years she'd been on his floor, and that was only because she'd corrected his medication dosage calculation in front of a patient family. He'd been wrong by a factor that could have caused a cardiac event. She'd said it quietly, almost under her breath. The way you might mention someone had spinach in their teeth. He'd fixed the order without acknowledging her. Afterward, in the hallway, he'd told the senior resident that the nursing staff needed to remember their lane. Mara had heard him. She'd written the correct dosage in the patient's chart, signed her name, and gone back to the trauma bay. That was 3 years ago. She hadn't spoken directly to Preston Gage since. On the night the black SUVs arrived, Mara was 7 hours into a 12-hour shift, standing at the workstation outside Bay 4, updating a chart for a construction worker who'd come in with a nail gun injury to his left palm. Routine. The kind of case that made the overnight hours stretch. She was typing with 2 fingers, which nobody knew was deliberate. She could type faster and didn't like drawing attention to it. When she heard the ambulance bay doors blow open with the particular violence that meant something had gone wrong somewhere, and badly. She turned before the sound registered consciously. The stretcher came through first. The man on it was large, broad across the chest, wearing what had been a military field uniform before it became something else entirely. The front of it was dark and wet. Someone had packed his left side with field dressings that were already failing. His face was gray in the way that faces go gray when the body is making executive decisions about where to send blood, and the answer it keeps arriving at is not the extremities. 4 people moved with the stretcher, 2 were tactical, armed, scanning the room with the specific kind of controlled alertness that doesn't belong in a hospital. One was a medic still pressing on the wound pack with both hands, and one was the woman with the colonel's insignia who was already talking before she'd cleared the door. GSW and fragmentation, left thoracic, field decompression performed at 37 minutes post-injury. He's been in and out. We need a trauma surgeon, and we need him now. Desmond Price stepped forward from the charge desk. We'll get Dr. Gage paged. I don't need your paging system. The colonel's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I need Mara Voss. Where is she? The room did something rooms shouldn't do, which was stop entirely. An ER has a rhythm. The beeping, the shuffling, the low-grade constant noise of people who don't have time to be quiet. And when all of that stops, you feel it like a pressure change, like something is about to break. Desmond's eyes moved before the rest of him did, locating Mara at the workstation by Bay 4. That's her right there, but she's a nurse, ma'am. She's not. I know what she is. The colonel was already moving toward her. Voss. Mara had not moved. She was looking at the man on the stretcher, and something in her face had shifted in a way that was hard to name. Not recognition exactly, more like the closing of a door that she'd left open for a very long time. How long since the initial injury? She said. 41 minutes now. The medic's voice was clipped. Fragmentation pattern is consistent with IED secondary blast. We've got at least 2 pieces we couldn't locate in the field. Breath sounds are diminished on the left and getting worse. His pressure's been dropping since the second decel. Mara pulled on gloves before the last word was out. She moved to the stretcher, leaned in, pressed 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck, then placed a hand on his chest and counted something silently that nobody else was tracking. What's his name? She said. Sergeant First Class Ryan Odell. The man on the stretcher moved his lips. His eyes were half open, and they'd found Mara's face. He said something that came out barely above the sound of breathing, but she was close enough to catch it. Figured you'd be somewhere like this, he said. Somewhere nobody'd think to look. Stop talking, she said. You're wasting air you don't have. Dr. Preston Gage arrived in the trauma bay 4 minutes later, which was faster than usual because the charge nurse had used the word military on the phone, and something in that word made him move at a different speed. He came in with his white coat half-fastened and his reading glasses still pushed up on his head, and he took in the scene, the armed personnel, the colonel, the patient in military uniform, and walked straight to the stretcher with the confident stride of a man who considers any room he enters to automatically be his. He stopped when he got close enough to realize Mara was already there. What's the situation? He said, not to her. The colonel answered. Fragmentation injury, left thoracic, possible pericardial involvement. Your nurse has been doing the preliminary assessment. My nurse? Gage looked at Mara the way people look at something they're certain they understand. Step back, Voss. I've got this. The entry wound is lower than it looks. Mara didn't step back. The field dressing is masking a secondary puncture about 4 centimeters inferior to where they packed. The breath sounds on the left aren't just diminished. They're absent below the 3rd intercostal. This isn't a simple pneumo. Gage put on gloves and leaned in. Let me be the one to assess, please. I've already assessed. He needs imaging immediately, and if we're going to the OR, whoever's going to the OR needs to know that the fragmentation pattern on this injury is not consistent with a standard GSW. The pieces are going to be seated differently than you're expecting. There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that meant something had landed, but the person it had landed on wasn't ready to show it. I'm aware of what I'm looking at, Gage said. Thank you for your input. Mara stepped back. Not because she agreed with him, because she'd learned years ago where the line was, and she knew what happened when you crossed it without the right leverage. She crossed her arms and watched him work. He was not incompetent. That was the complicated part about Preston Gage. He was genuinely skilled, and the years had not taken that from him. But he assessed the wound the way he'd been trained to assess civilian trauma, which was logical for someone who had never worked outside a civilian trauma center. And it meant his hands moved to where he expected the problem to be instead of where the problem actually was. He called for imaging. He didn't argue with that part. The portable X-ray unit came in 90 seconds, and the images were up on the screen in another 3 minutes, and Gage stood there looking at them with the senior resident, Dr. Fiona Lau, at his shoulder. Fiona saw it first. She was 29, 2 years out of medical school, still in the phase of training where you look at everything without the filter of assumption. She said nothing because Gage was right there, and she had learned the same lesson Mara had, just through a different door, But her eyes moved to the cluster of white on the left side of the image, and then her eyes moved to Mara. Mara nodded, once, very slightly. The fragmentation, Gage said slowly, is there. He pointed to the largest piece. That's our primary concern. There are 3 pieces, Mara said. I can see the images. The third one is not on the primary film because of the angle. The medic can tell you where the blast origin was. Given that origin and the patient's reported body position at the time of the blast, the third fragment would be sitting about here. She pointed to a location on Odell's chest without touching him. It's going to be very close to the pericardium. That's why his pressure is dropping like this. Gage looked at her for a moment. You're reading blast geometry from a field medic's verbal report. I'm reading blast geometry from 11 years of experience treating exactly this kind of injury. Something changed in the room. It was slow, the way temperature changes. Not a single moment, but a gradual shift that you only notice when you're suddenly cold. The colonel, who had been standing at the periphery with her arms crossed, straightened almost imperceptibly. The 2 tactical personnel exchanged a look. Fiona Lau stopped pretending to look at the chart. You're a trauma nurse, Gage said. Yes. With 11 years of experience treating IED fragmentation injuries. Among other things. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Where? She didn't answer that. Odell answered it for her. His voice was barely there now, thin as paper, but the room was quiet enough that it carried. She was our battalion surgeon, 2 tours. Then another one nobody talks about. He stopped to breathe, which was an effort. There's a reason the colonel drove 4 hours to this specific hospital in this specific city. There's a reason she asked for Mara Voss and not whoever you are. Gage turned to the colonel. Is this accurate? That information, the colonel said evenly, is not something I'm going to discuss in a trauma bay. I need to know what I'm dealing with. What you're dealing with, the colonel said, is a man who has 40 minutes, maybe less, and a woman standing in your ER who has kept people alive in conditions you cannot imagine. I'd suggest you spend less time verifying her credentials and more time figuring out how you're going to work together. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the previous ones. It had weight. Gage turned back to the imaging. He pointed to the area Mara had indicated. You're saying there's a third fragment here. I'm saying there's a high probability. You'll need a CT to confirm, but he won't tolerate the time that takes if his pressure drops below 70. And if you're wrong, then you open him up and there's no third fragment. You still have to deal with the first 2, which are themselves not straightforward extractions. So the downside of being wrong is that you went into a surgery you already had to do anyway with accurate information about the other 2 fragments. Gage looked at her for a long time. It was the look of a man who has spent 22 years being the smartest person in every room he enters, and who has just encountered something he doesn't have a category for. The OR, he said. Prep OR 3. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos of the specific kind that hospitals are built for. The choreography of crisis, everyone moving fast and precise toward a single point. Odell went up on the elevator, Gage and Fiona with him, the OR team already scrubbed and waiting. The colonel stayed in the trauma bay. The tactical personnel stationed themselves in the hallway outside the elevator with the quiet professionalism of people who are used to waiting for news they may not want. Mara stripped her gloves and began restocking the supply cart. Because that was her job. Because she was a nurse, and her part in this was finished, and the next part would happen without her in a room she didn't have privileges to enter. Desmond came up beside her. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. What was that? He said finally. What was what? The fragment thing, the blast geometry. He kept his voice low. How did you know that? I've seen a lot of trauma, she said. Mara. He said her name the way people say it when they want you to stop pretending. 11 years. He said 11 years? You've been here for 3. She placed a box of gauze packs on the cart with more care than they required. That's a long time before this. What were you before this? She looked at him. Desmond Price, who arrived late half the time and kept a photo of his daughter tucked into his ID badge, and once cried in the supply closet after a pediatric code and thought nobody knew. She'd known him 3 years and he still didn't have a complete picture of her, and that was not an accident. I was something else, she said. He waited. And then I wasn't. She picked up the cart and moved it toward Bay 2, and Desmond let her go because he understood the way people who've lost things understand the particular way other people carry their losses. The OR call came down 47 minutes later, not from Gage, from Fiona, which was irregular enough that Desmond picked up the phone with his eyebrows already up. He listened for 9 seconds. Then he said, "Hold on," and covered the receiver and looked across the trauma bay to where Mara was changing out a saline bag on a post-op patient. "Fiona's asking for you," he said. Mara didn't turn around. "To do what?" She didn't say to do what. She said, and I'm quoting, that Dr. Gage needs a consult and the patient is declining and they need you upstairs now. The saline bag was hung. The line was checked. Mara pressed the roller clamp open to the appropriate rate. She took off her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin. "Tell her I'm on my way," she said. The elevator took 45 seconds. She spent them looking at the floor numbers and not thinking about the operating room she was about to walk into, not thinking about the last operating room, not thinking about the way the light looks in a field surgical unit at 0300 when the generator is struggling and you're working by headlamp, and the nearest backup is 3 hours out by helicopter, and the man on your table has about 90 seconds if you make the wrong call. She'd spent 3 years not thinking about that. She stepped off the elevator on the 4th floor and walked toward OR3 with her hands at her sides. Through the observation window, she could see Gage at the table. She could see the patient's open chest cavity and the specific way Gage was holding his hands. Still, which was wrong. You didn't hold still in there. Still meant you'd hit something you didn't expect. Fiona was at the scrub sink. She turned when she heard Mara's footsteps. "What's happening?" Mara said. "Third fragment," Fiona said. "You were right. It's sitting against the pericardium, but the approach he used..." She stopped. The other 2 fragments shifted when he made the first incision. It changed the geometry of everything in there. He's trying to figure out how to get to the third one without what? Without touching the pericardium in a way that causes it to rupture. Fiona's voice was careful. He hasn't done this before. Not exactly this. Nobody's done it in a civilian OR, Mara said. It's a battlefield extraction technique. It was developed because... She stopped. It doesn't matter why it was developed. Fiona looked at her with the direct, unadorned attention of someone too tired to perform anything. Can you do it? Mara looked through the observation window. Gage hadn't moved. The perfusionist was watching the monitors with the specific alertness of someone who is watching numbers go in the wrong direction and waiting for someone to tell them what to do about it. He'd have to ask me, she said. I know. He won't ask me. I know that too. Fiona turned back to the sink. But I thought someone should tell you what's happening in there, in case you wanted to be near a phone. Mara stood at the window for a moment. On the table, Ryan Odell's pressure was dropping on the monitor above the surgical field. She could see the numbers from where she stood. 68/40, 64. She pushed through the OR door. The OR door had a specific resistance to it, the kind built into surgical suite entrances to maintain pressure differential, and Mara felt it push back against her palm for exactly the half second it took her to decide she wasn't stopping. She came through scrubbed but not sterile, which meant she was already wrong by the standards of this room, and she knew it, and she came in anyway. You can't be in here without... The scrub tech started. Get her a gown. Gage's voice came from the table without him looking up. It was flat. It had none of the authority he usually performed with it. That flatness told her more than his words did. She gowned and gloved in 40 seconds. The scrub tech was fast, to her credit, and didn't ask questions. Mara moved to the table on the opposite side from Gage and looked into the chest cavity and took a breath that she let out slowly through her nose. The geometry was worse than she'd expected. The 2 accessible fragments had shifted medially when Gage made his primary incision, which wasn't his fault. It was the nature of fragmentation injury in soft tissue. The pieces move as surrounding structures relax under anesthesia and the body stops bracing against pain. But the result was that the third fragment, the one she'd predicted, was now sitting in a position that was functionally inaccessible by standard approach. It was resting against the pericardial sac at an angle that meant any direct attempt to grab it would either perforate the sac or deflect the fragment further inward. She'd seen this exact configuration once before. She'd been 29 years old, and it had been raining, and the generator had cut out twice during the procedure. "I need a different retractor," she said. "Not the one you're using, smaller, and I need it angled differently. I'm aware of the options available. I'm not questioning what you know. I'm telling you what this specific injury needs." She kept her voice level. Not deferential, not aggressive, the same tone she'd used 100 times in spaces where the person across from her had rank and she had information. "The approach for this fragment isn't through the primary field. You have to come at it from below and lateral, almost as if you're coming up from underneath. The angle feels wrong, but it protects the sac." Gage was quiet for a moment. Around the table, nobody moved. The anesthesiologist, a compact man named Terrence Obi, who had been doing his job for 17 years and had learned when to stay invisible, watched the monitors and said nothing. "That approach would put pressure on the left ventricle, yes, briefly, for about 8 seconds if you move correctly. The pressure resolves as soon as the fragment clears." She paused. "The alternative is what you're currently looking at, which is no clear path." Another silence. Odell's pressure read 61 on the monitor. "Show me," Gage said. She showed him. Not by taking over. She didn't have his hands in this OR. He was the surgeon of record, and she was a nurse with no surgical privileges at Harlow General, and both of them knew it. But by talking him through the geometry the way you talk someone through a route they've never driven. "Left here, not right. Slower through this part. The landmark you're looking for is this, not that." He listened. That was the thing she hadn't been sure he was capable of, and he did it. Not gracefully, not without the occasional stiffening of his jaw that meant he was working against instinct, but he listened. The fragment came out in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It wasn't clean. 2 of those minutes were a period where Odell's pressure dropped to 53, and Terrence called it out in a voice that was professionally calm and personally terrified, and Gage's hand stopped moving, and Mara said quietly, "Don't stop. Keep going. The pressure drop is from the approach, not from damage. It'll recover when you clear it." And Gage had no way to know if that was true, except that she'd said it with the specific steadiness of someone stating a fact rather than offering a hope. The pressure recovered. The fragment cleared. Terrence exhaled. It was a very small sound, and it filled the room. Gage stood there with the fragment in the extraction forceps and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked across the table at Mara. She was already checking Odell's pericardium for any micro tears the fragment might have caused on its way out. She found one, small, manageable, and pointed it out to Gage without fanfare. He repaired it. She monitored. They did not speak except in the specific shorthand of 2 people working the same problem from different angles, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was functional, and functional was what mattered with a man's heart 6 inches from their hands. When they closed, it was 1:14 in the morning. Mara stepped back from the table and stripped her gloves. She was aware of being looked at. The scrub tech, the circulator, Fiona through the observation window, Terrence over the top of his anesthesia screen. With the particular attention that accumulates when people have just watched something they don't have a category for. She dropped the gloves in the bin. She pulled off her gown. "Voss!" Gage's voice caught her at the door. She turned. He was still at the table, still looking at his patient. He didn't look at her when he said it. "Where did you learn that approach?" She held the door. Considered the question and what honest answer it had, and what she was prepared to give this man who had told his residents she needed to remember her lane. "In a place where not knowing it meant someone died," she said. She let the door close behind her. The hallway outside the OR was bright and quiet in the way hospital hallways are at that hour. All the soft overhead lighting and no visitors and the distant sound of a cart moving somewhere around a corner. Mara stood against the wall across from the door and did what she'd trained herself to do after any high-stakes procedure. Breathe, count 4 things she could see, locate her own hands, come back to the present. The wall was beige, the floor was gray. The exit sign at the end of the hall was red. The clock above the nurse station read 1:16. Her hands were at her sides. She was in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was a nurse. That was what she was. Colonel Diane Farrow was waiting at the end of the corridor, standing with her back to the window and her arms crossed, and her expression arranged in the careful blankness of someone who has learned to wait for bad news without showing the anticipating of it. She looked up when she heard Mara's footsteps. "He's out," Mara said. "Pressure stable. The fragment was where I said it would be. There was a minor pericardial tear that Gage repaired. Assuming no complications in recovery, he should be looking at 6 to 8 weeks of restricted activity, then gradual return." Farrow closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. "Thank you?" "I'm a nurse. I assisted. Dr. Gage did the surgery." "Don't do that," Farrow said. "Do what?" "Minimize it." Her voice wasn't sharp. It was direct in the way of someone who doesn't have patience for performances of modesty. "I drove 4 hours because Ryan Odell is one of the 6 people alive who knows everything that happened at Kessler Station, and I needed him to stay alive, and I knew you were here because we've known where you were for 2 years. Mara went still. "You've been tracking me," she said. "We've been aware of your location. There's a difference." "That's a difference that depends entirely on who you ask." Farrow took a breath. "Mara, what happened at Kessler Station is 3 years ago." The words came out harder than she intended. "And it's not something I'm discussing in a hospital hallway at 1 in the morning. "Then when?" "Not tonight." Farrow looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has learned that some battles are not won by pressing forward. "Odell needs to speak with you when he's recovered enough, not about the surgery. He has information he's been carrying for 3 years, and he says you're the one who needs to have it. Whatever Ryan Odell has to say, it concerns the investigation." Farrow's voice dropped, not because anyone was nearby, but because the words warranted it. "The one that should have happened, the one that didn't." Mara said nothing. "There are people who made sure it didn't," Farrow continued, "and Ryan has documentation." The clock at the end of the hall ticked forward to 1:17. "He needs to rest," Mara said finally. "He just came out of surgery. Whatever he has to say will keep until he can say it without stressing a freshly repaired pericardium." Farrow nodded. "Room and a guard will be arranged. My team stays in the building tonight." "This isn't a military installation." "No, but the people Ryan is carrying information about don't particularly care about jurisdictional boundaries, so I'd rather not test that." Mara watched her walk back toward the elevator. Farrow moved the way people move when they've spent long enough in operational environments that the habit never quite leaves. Deliberate, aware of exits, unhurried without being slow. Mara went back down to the trauma bay. She had 4 hours left in her shift. The rest of the night was ordinary, which felt surreal in the specific way that ordinary things do when they follow extraordinary ones. A teenager with a dislocated shoulder from a skateboarding fall. An elderly man with chest pain that turned out to be severe acid reflux and not the cardiac event his son had driven him in fearing. A woman in her 40s with a deep laceration on her forearm from a broken glass that required 8 sutures and a conversation about whether her home environment was safe, which she answered with the particular forced lightness of someone for whom the answer was complicated. Mara did all of it with the same steady presence she brought to every shift, and nobody looking at her would have known that 4 hours ago she'd been guiding a cardiac extraction in an OR she had no privileges to be in. Desmond watched her. He was subtle about it, which was not his natural mode, but he managed. At 5:40 a.m., with 20 minutes left in the shift, he brought her a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for and set it on the counter beside her. "You don't drink coffee," he said. "I don't." "I know." He sat down in the chair across from her. "So you can ignore it, and I'll drink it myself in a minute, but I wanted an excuse to sit here." He folded his hands on the desk. "The OR team is talking. They usually are. Specifically about you." He kept his voice low. The trauma bay was quiet at this hour, the overnight cases resolved or stable, the morning rush not yet begun. Fiona told the overnight resident. The overnight resident told the charge nurse from the surgical floor. "You know how this goes." "I know how this goes," she agreed. By 7 a.m., the entire day shift is going to know that you walked into an OR at 1 in the morning and talked a cardiac extraction out of a trauma surgeon who apparently had no idea what to do with it. He paused. Is that an accurate description of what happened? It's a compressed one. Mara. He said her name the way he'd said it earlier, the way that meant he was putting down the professional distance and just being a person. I've worked with you for 3 years. You're the best trauma nurse I've seen in 22 years doing this job. I don't say that to a lot of people. I don't say it to you because you'd find a way to make it about the protocol or the team or something other than yourself. He looked at her steadily. But I'm saying it now because what I watched tonight was not a nurse. She looked at her hands on the desk. They were ordinary-looking hands. A small scar across the second knuckle of her right index finger where a rib retractor had slipped once in difficult conditions. She'd sewn it closed herself because there'd been nobody else to do it. I was a surgeon, she said, a long time ago. Desmond didn't react with surprise, which meant part of him had already arrived at that conclusion. Why are you here? Why this? Night shift trauma nurse? Because I needed to be somewhere where I wasn't what I used to be. She picked up the coffee she didn't drink and held it for something to do with her hands. And because it turned out I was still useful, just differently. Something happened. Something happened. And you're not going to tell me what? Not at 5:40 in the morning, no. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then, for what it's worth, what you did tonight. Ryan Odell's alive because of you. That's not complicated. Everything else around it might be, but that part isn't. She set the coffee down. Get some rest when you go home. You've got that same tired look you get in your left eye when you've been here too long. He smiled despite himself. You notice the weirdest things about people. Occupational habit, she said. The day shift began arriving at 6, the overlap period where the trauma bay filled with the specific energy of people who'd slept and people who hadn't in the same space. Mara gave her report to the incoming nurse, a methodical man named Carlos who took meticulous notes and asked 3 clarifying questions and thanked her, which not everyone did. She collected her canvas tote bag from her locker. She changed out of her scrubs. She walked out through the side entrance. She was halfway to her car when she heard her name. Preston Gage was standing at the edge of the parking structure, still in his surgical attire, his white coat folded over one arm. He looked like he'd been waiting there for a few minutes, which he clearly had, because the posture of someone waiting is different from the posture of someone arriving, and he had the former. She stopped. He walked toward her. He stopped about 6 feet away, which was a slightly formal distance, and she noted it because the distance people choose tells you what they're not sure how to do with their hands. I owe you something, he said. She waited. I'm not good at this, he said. It came out with the slight roughness of someone acknowledging a thing they've known about themselves for a long time without having had to say it out loud before. I've been told I'm not good at this. An apology. I don't... He stopped, started again. I've been dismissive of you since you came here, that medication order correction, and other things before and after it. I made an assumption about what you were capable of, and I maintained it even when there was evidence against it. Mara watched him. You could have let him die tonight, Gage said. If you'd stayed downstairs, by the rules of this hospital, by the rules of your job description, you had no obligation to be in that OR. I had no basis to listen to you even when you were talking. You were correct. I was not. He looked somewhere past her left shoulder, then back. I don't know what you were before you came to Harlow General, and I'm not going to pretend the circumstances would have led me to treat you differently if I'd known, because I don't know if that's true. I might have just found a different reason to dismiss you. He paused. But I'd like to think I'm capable of being wrong and acknowledging it, even when it's inconvenient. She looked at him for a moment. He was genuine. She'd been in enough rooms with enough people who were performing remorse versus actually sitting in it to know the difference, and he was the latter, uncomfortable and unsure and real. What you did in that OR, she said carefully, was harder than what I did. I had the information. You had to trust someone you had no reason to trust, under pressure, with a patient in front of you. That's not nothing. He seemed to not know what to do with that. Get some sleep, she said. You've got a post-op to check on in a few hours. She walked to her car. She drove home on autopilot, which was fine because she knew the 7 minutes of turns between the hospital and the apartment complex without having to think about them. She'd mapped them her first week in Raleigh the same way she'd mapped everything. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the same habit that makes people check exits when they enter rooms. She parked. She went upstairs. She put her tote bag on the kitchen table. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and did nothing. The apartment was small and clean and had almost nothing on the walls. There was a bookshelf with medical references and 2 paperback novels she'd read 4 times each, and a small framed photograph that she kept facing away from the room, turned toward the wall because she hadn't been able to throw it away, but hadn't been able to look at it either. 12 people in that photograph, 7 of them still alive. She made tea she didn't drink and sat on the couch and stared at the middle distance and eventually fell asleep without meaning to, still upright, with the tea cooling on the table beside her. She woke at 11 a.m. to her phone buzzing. Fiona Lau's name on the screen. She answered. "Odell is awake," Fiona said. "He's asking for you. And I'm sorry to call you at home. I know you just got off, but there's something else." Mara straightened. "What?" "Dr. Gage is in a meeting with the chief of staff and the hospital administrator. I don't know what it's about, but it started an hour ago, and someone from the nursing administration office came and pulled Mara Voss's personnel file about 40 minutes into it. The kitchen was the same as it always was. The tea was cold. "I'm coming in," Mara said. The drive back was different from the drive home. The drive home had been gray and winding down. This drive was something else. The sensation of a thing that had been sitting still beginning to move, not because she was pushing it, but because it had its own momentum now, and she was simply in its path. She went to Odell's room first. Pharaoh's guard was in the hallway, a young man in civilian clothes who had the specific kind of stillness that wasn't rest. He looked at her and moved aside without being asked, which meant Pharaoh had given him her description. Odell was elevated in the bed, which was a good sign. His color was still poor. It would be for days, but his eyes were focused and tracking and had some of the sharpness back in them. He was hooked to 3 monitors and an IV line, and had a nasal cannula across his face that he'd pushed up slightly because it bothered him, which she made a mental note to address. "The cannula," she said, before he could say anything. "It itches." "It itches because your nose is dry, not because of the cannula. There's saline spray on the tray." She moved it to within his reach. "Don't pull it off. Your SAT was at 92 an hour ago." "How do you know what my SAT was an hour ago?" "Because I called the floor nurse from the car." She sat in the chair beside the bed. "Pharaoh said you have something to tell me." He looked at her. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was choosing his words, which she remembered from 3 years ago, and apparently some things didn't change. "You remember Major Corbin Hask," he said. It wasn't a question. You didn't forget Corbin Hask. "Yes," she said. "He's a colonel now. He was promoted 18 months ago." Odell paused to breathe, which was still an effort. The investigation into Kessler Station, the one that was supposed to happen and didn't, he's the reason it didn't. He had the after-action reports altered before they reached the review board. Mara felt something in her chest that wasn't physical. That's an allegation. "I have the originals." He reached for the tray table with the specific, careful movement of a man working around a repaired thoracic cavity. There was a phone on the tray, military grade, the kind that doesn't look like anything from a commercial store. "I photographed them before he got to the file copies. Every alteration is documented. What the originals say about what happened that night, what was changed, and whose authorization signature appears on the altered versions." He set the phone down in front of her. Every name that should have been on a court-martial proceeding 3 years ago and wasn't. She looked at the phone but didn't pick it up. "Why now?" she said. "Because Hask is being considered for a senior command position. If he gets it, he'll have oversight of 4 operational units. And he'll be the person who decides whether people like the ones who are under your command at Kessler Station have adequate support in the field." He met her eyes. "He won't. He didn't 3 years ago, and he won't now. People will die because the person responsible for keeping them alive has spent 3 years working on making sure nobody could hold him accountable for the last time people died. The monitoring equipment beeped its steady rhythm. Ryan, her voice was careful. This level of documentation, what's it going to cost you to surface it? He looked at the ceiling. More than I'd like. Less than it would cost to not surface it. The people who altered those reports didn't stop at alteration. If they find out you have this, they might already know. He looked at her. Why do you think I came here instead of a military hospital? Why do you think Pharaoh drove 4 hours? There are 2 people I trust with this, and one of them is lying in this bed, and the other one, he stopped. The other one spent 3 years hiding in a trauma bay because someone made sure she blamed herself for something that was done to her. The words sat there in the room. Mara stood. She went to the window. Raleigh outside was bright and ordinary. Traffic, a food cart on the corner, a woman walking a dog with 3 legs. Regular life happening at its regular pace. She had spent 3 years making herself into something small. Something that didn't take up space, didn't claim authority, didn't ask to be seen. And it had worked. She'd been invisible. She'd been safe. She'd also spent 3 years watching Ryan Odell's face in her sleep, and the faces of 11 others, and one of them she didn't see anymore because Dominic Farwell was 24 years old when he died, and his face wasn't something she got to hold on to. She turned back from the window. Odell watched her with the specific patience of someone who has waited a long time for something and learned not to rush the last part. I need to see the documents, she said. I know. And I need to speak with Pharaoh tonight. She'll be here. And Ryan, she paused, you need to eat something and stop pushing that cannula up your nose. He almost smiled. It pulled at his face in a way that looked like it cost him something, but it was there. Some things don't change. No, she said. Some things don't. She left his room and walked back toward the elevator and was 3 steps from it when her phone buzzed again. A text from Fiona. The meeting just ended. Gage came out and went directly to his office. Nursing administration is asking for you to report to the 3rd floor conference room at 2 p.m. I don't know what for, but the hospital administrator is going to be there. Mara looked at the message. Then she looked at the time. It was 12:38. She had an hour and 22 minutes to figure out what Preston Gage had said in that room, and whether the conversation she'd had with him in the parking structure this morning had been a genuine reckoning or the prelude to something else entirely. She stepped into the elevator. On the 3rd floor, the door to the Chief of Staff's office was closed. She could hear voices through it. Not the words, just the cadence. 2 voices, maybe 3, with the flattened effect of institutional language, the particular tone of people making decisions about other people in rooms those people aren't in. She pressed the elevator button for the ground floor. She had an hour. The ground floor was busy in the way hospital ground floors get around midday. The shift overlap resolved, the morning cases processed, the steady mid-morning pace settling into something that felt almost like routine. Mara walked through it without stopping, past the reception desk and the family waiting area and the vending machines that hummed against the far wall, and she went into the small family consultation room at the end of the main corridor because it was almost always empty at this hour, and it had a door that locked. She sat down at the table. She put her phone face up in front of her and looked at it. An hour and 20 minutes. She needed to know what had been said in that meeting before she walked into a room with a hospital administrator. Because walking into institutional proceedings without information was how people got managed instead of heard. She'd learned that the same place she'd learned most things, the hard way, in a context where the stakes were considerably less negotiable than a performance review. She called Fiona. Tell me everything you know, she said when Fiona picked up. Not what you think, what you actually know. Fiona was quiet for a second, the brief pause of someone sorting signal from noise. Gage went into the Chief of Staff's office at 9 this morning. His secretary told me that because she thought it was a routine post-op debrief, major surgery, military personnel, she figured it was protocol. About 40 minutes in, Dr. Reisner from hospital administration was called in. That's when nursing pulled your file. Dr. Wallace Reisner. Mara had seen him twice in 3 years. Once at a hospital-wide staff meeting she'd attended because it was mandatory, once in the parking structure where he'd cut her off without noticing. He had the particular quality of senior administrators who had spent so long in conference rooms that they'd stopped being able to read the rooms where actual work happened. "Do you know who initiated the meeting?" Mara said. "No, but—" Fiona hesitated. "Gage came out first. He walked past me in the corridor and he stopped, which he never does. And he said, 'Whatever happens in that meeting, what you saw last night was exceptional work.' And then he walked away." Mara processed that. "That could mean he was defending you," Fiona said. "Or it could mean he was managing his conscience before something bad." "Or both," Mara said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." She ended the call. She had 74 minutes. She used them to go to the 4th floor and check on Odell's vitals herself, which was technically outside her role since he was now an inpatient and not a trauma bay patient, but the floor nurse was a woman named Preeta who had worked with Mara enough times across overflow situations to simply hand her the chart without commentary. His oxygen sat had come up to 96. His pressure was holding. He was asleep, which was exactly what he should be doing. She updated a note in the chart about the cannula placement and the hydration order and went back downstairs. At 1:58 p.m., she walked into the 3rd floor conference room. Reisner was already there, seated at the head of the table with a folder in front of him. He was 61 and silver-haired and had the slightly preoccupied expression of a man whose calendar was full and who would very much like this particular item on it to resolve quickly. Beside him was a woman Mara didn't recognize. Young, early 30s, dark blazer, a legal pad in front of her and a pen she was turning in her fingers. The pen turning was the nervous tick of someone who was either new to this kind of meeting or who had been briefed that it might be complicated. Gage was not there. That told her something. "Ms. Voss," Reisner said, "please sit." She sat. She placed her hands flat on the table and kept them there, which was a decision. It signaled composure without being performative about it. "We've been reviewing last night's events," Reisner began, "specifically your involvement in the surgical procedure performed on Sergeant Odell." "I assisted at Dr. Gage's request," she said. "Dr. Gage has confirmed that, yes." Reisner opened the folder. "What we're looking at is the nature of that assistance. You entered an active sterile field. You provided what has been described as procedural guidance during a complex cardiac extraction. And in doing so, you—" He paused, and she could see him choosing words. "You operated in a capacity that exceeds your licensed scope of practice at this institution." Mara looked at him. "The Medical Licensing Board has specific—" "I'm aware of what the licensing board has," she said. "I didn't perform surgery. I advised a surgeon who was performing surgery. There's a legal distinction." The woman with the legal pad wrote something. "The distinction," Reisner said, "becomes complicated when the advisory is of such a specific and directive nature that the outcome would not have occurred without it. Our legal team believes that creates a gray area." "Your legal team is welcome to that opinion." She kept her voice even. "The outcome also wouldn't have occurred if the patient had died on the table, which was the alternative. I'd suggest the gray area is significantly less complicated when you factor in that a man is alive this morning." Reisner's expression didn't change, which was itself an expression. "Ms. Voss, we're not questioning the outcome. We're questioning whether the institution is exposed by the process." She understood then. Not that it surprised her, but understanding it precisely was different from anticipating it generally. This wasn't about last night. This was about liability. It was about a hospital administrator looking at an extraordinary set of events and seeing not the extraordinary part, but the word that appeared beside it, unauthorized. "You're suspending me," she said. Reisner folded his hands. "We're placing you on administrative leave pending review, with pay, and with— for how long?" "Until the review is complete. It's standard procedure when—" "How long?" She wasn't raising her voice. The repetition was a different kind of pressure. "We estimate 4 to 6 weeks." 4 to 6 weeks while Odell was in a hospital room with classified documents on a military-grade phone, while Farrow's team was in the building, while Corbin Hask was in Washington being considered for a senior command position that would put 4 operational units under his authority. She looked at the woman with the legal pad. "Are you representing the hospital, or is this an independent review?" The woman blinked. "I'm the risk management coordinator for the hospital." so you're not independent. She looked back at Reisner. I want to be clear about what you're doing here. A nurse used clinical knowledge to help a surgeon save a patient's life. The patient is a decorated military operator who was transported here specifically because of that nurse's background and capabilities. And the institutional response is to remove her from the floor. It's not a punitive action. The effect is punitive regardless of the intent. She stood. I'll comply with the administrative leave. I'd like the terms in writing before I leave the building. She picked up her phone from the table. And I'd like Dr. Gage's statement included in whatever documentation is prepared. The full statement, not a summary. Reisner blinked. That's standard in any review process that might involve licensing board scrutiny, yes. She moved toward the door. I've been on the other end of these processes before. I know how they work. She walked out. The corridor outside was empty except for a housekeeping cart and the distant sound of a phone ringing at the nurse station. She walked to the elevator and waited for it, and while she waited, she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. Not racing, not spiked, just present and slightly louder than normal, the way it got when her body recognized something her mind was still processing. She had just been suspended. She had also, in the same moment, confirmed that the hospital's primary concern was institutional exposure, not clinical wrongdoing, which meant the actual argument here wasn't whether she'd done something wrong. It was about who had standing to define what right looked like. That was a winnable argument, but not in a conference room, and not today. She went to Odell's floor and told Farrow what had happened. Farrow listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Mara had always respected about her. She gathered complete information before she responded to any part of it. When Mara finished, Farrow was quiet for a moment. They suspended you, she said. Administrative leave. For saving his life. For exceeding my scope of practice in the process of saving his life. Farrow made a sound that was not quite a word. The documents Ryan has, you need to see them today, not tomorrow. I know. Because if the people Hask is connected to find out he arrived here and that Ryan is talking, the timeline on all of this gets compressed, significantly. Mara looked at her. How close are they? In terms of knowing? Ryan's transport was flagged 18 hours ago. We used a routing protocol that buys time, but not unlimited time. Farrow glanced at the guard in the hallway. We have maybe 36 hours before someone asks a question at a level high enough to get an answer. 36 hours. Odell in a hospital bed with a freshly repaired pericardium. Herself on administrative leave with no institutional standing. The documentation sitting on a phone in a room with a military guard outside it. Wake him up, Mara said. Farrow looked at her. Carefully. Don't stress the incision, but I need to see those files now, not tonight. Odell was awake by the time they got into the room. He'd apparently been half awake already, the light sleep of someone with pain that isn't quite managed, which Mara noted and would address in a moment. He unlocked the phone with a thumbprint and handed it to her without preamble. The photographs were meticulously taken. He'd used a high-resolution camera in controlled light, each page of the original document side by side with the corresponding altered version. The differences highlighted not with annotation but simply by arrangement. You could see the changes because he'd made them unavoidable to see. The alterations were surgical in their own way. Specific phrases, specific casualty attributions, specific lines about pre-mission intelligence that had been flagged as compromised and then unflagged in the revised version. In the original after-action report, the intelligence failure at Kessler Station was documented clearly. The unit had been sent into a grid coordinate that Field SIGINT had flagged as high-risk 22 hours before insertion. The flag had been received, it had been reviewed, and a senior officer had made the determination to proceed anyway, signing off on the insertion with a notation that the risk assessment was within acceptable parameters. That notation, in the altered version, did not exist. The flag itself had been reduced to a footnote. The sign-off was attributed to a different officer, a Captain Devin Waller, who had died at Kessler Station and therefore could not dispute it. Mara read that line twice. They had put it on Devin Waller, who was 26 years old, who had 3 sisters and a mother in Baton Rouge, and who had died because the insertion went wrong, and then had his name used to bury why it went wrong. She set the phone down on the tray table. She needed a moment she didn't take because there wasn't time for it. The sign-off in the original, she said. Hask? Hask, Odell confirmed. And he altered the reports himself? His authorization code appears on the file access logs at 0340 on the morning of the preliminary inquiry. The inquiry started at 0800. Odell coughed, carefully, pressing his arm across his chest the way the surgical team would have instructed. He had 4.5 hours. It was enough. But you had the originals because I pulled them the night before. I had a feeling. Not evidence. Just the specific feeling you get when something is being explained too cleanly, and the explanation doesn't match what you saw with your own eyes. He looked at the ceiling. I photographed everything I could access before they locked the files. I didn't know what I had until the altered version came out, and I compared it. Pharaoh was leaning against the wall near the door. We've had these documents for 14 months. We've been trying to identify the right channel to surface them without, she paused, without the channel being compromised before the documents reach anyone with authority to act on them. 14 months, Mara said. Why didn't you come to me 14 months ago? Because we weren't sure you were stable enough. Pharaoh's voice was careful but direct. What happened to you after Kessler Station, the way you left, the way you disappeared? We didn't know if coming to you with this would help or break me, Mara said. Pharaoh didn't deny it. She thought about 3 years ago. The board hearing that wasn't really a hearing, the way her resignation had been accepted with a speed that should have told her something, the severance package that seemed generous until you understood it, was actually a silence agreement that she'd been too gutted to read carefully. She thought about the apartment with nothing on the walls, and the photograph turned to face away and the 11 minutes early every shift because structure was the only thing that worked when everything else was noise. She hadn't been stable. Pharaoh wasn't wrong. I'm stable now, she said. I know, Pharaoh said. That's why Ryan asked for you. She picked up the phone again and went back through the documents. She was looking for something specific, a question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Odell had first mentioned Hask's name. In any falsification of this scale, there were always two problems: the documents themselves and the chain of people who knew. The documents could be surfaced. The chain of people who knew was a different vulnerability, because those people could be pressured, relocated, or simply not believed. How many people have seen these originals? She said. 3, Odell said. Me, Pharaoh, and a JAG officer named Brissette, who we trusted and who subsequently transferred to a posting in Japan. He has a copy. Have any of the 3 of you been approached, formally or informally? Pharaoh and Odell exchanged a look. Ryan was approached, Pharaoh said. Mara looked at him. 8 months ago, he said. A representative contact, someone reached out through a mutual service connection suggesting that certain information I might be holding could affect my career trajectory. The phrasing was friendly. The implication was clear. And you? I told the contact that I didn't know what they were referring to and that they should have a good evening. He looked at her steadily. I've been careful since, which is why I look the way I look and ended up on a stretcher in your ER. She sat with that. The contact 8 months ago, the IED 14 hours ago. The gap between them was either coincidence or escalation, and she didn't have enough information to determine which, but she knew which one her instincts said. I need the name of the mutual service connection, she said. Mara. Ryan. I need it. He said a name. She didn't recognize it directly, but she recognized the unit designation attached to it, which was enough. She filed it and moved on. The JAG officer in Japan. Brissette. Can you reach him securely? Pharaoh can, he said. He needs to be in contact with a military law office that isn't connected to any of Hask's command relationships. A completely clean chain. Can you identify one? Yes, Pharaoh said. Then that needs to happen in the next 24 hours. We have 36. We had 36 2 hours ago. Do it in 24. Pharaoh nodded. She pulled out her own phone and stepped toward the window. Mara looked at Odell. He was watching her with that expression again, the same one he'd had in the ER, the recognition of something returning, something that had been absent for a long time showing back up in someone's face. You look like yourself, he said. Don't, she said. There are still a lot of ways this goes wrong. I know. He shifted against the pillow, careful, the calculation of movement against pain that post-surgical patients spend their first days learning. But there's a difference between looking like yourself and having it worked out. You can be both. She didn't answer that. What she did instead was take out her own phone and open the contact she'd never deleted and never called in 3 years. A number with a Virginia area code that belonged to a former colleague who had left the military 2 years before she did and gone into a kind of consulting work that was deliberately vague in its description and very specific in its actual function. His name was Terrell Wade, and he owed her a professional favor from a situation in 2019 that neither of them ever talked about directly. She sent a text. No greeting, no context, just 4 words and a number. Clean channel, call me. The reply came in 11 minutes. 2 hours. Secure line. She put the phone in her pocket. She adjusted Odell's cannula, which he'd pushed up again, and he didn't argue this time. Try to eat something, she said. The floor nurse will bring a tray. You're not my nurse anymore. I'm not your anything right now, technically. Hospital put me on leave an hour ago. He stared at her. They suspended you. Administrative leave. For saving my life. For exceeding my scope of practice in the process. Apparently those are different things. He said something under his breath that she chose not to register. What are you going to do? She stood. She picked up her tote bag. She had 89 minutes before Terrell Wade called, and she needed to use them to write down every name, every date, every connection she could reconstruct from her own memory of Kessler Station, because memory was not evidence, but it was context, and context was what turned documents into a case. What I should have done 3 years ago, she said. She was at the door when her phone buzzed. Not a call, a notification from the hospital's internal staff communication system, which she was still logged into because nobody had formally processed her leave paperwork yet. She'd expected it to be administrative, the kind of auto-generated message that systems send when status changes. It wasn't that. It was a flagged alert from the security desk at the hospital's main entrance. 3 visitors. Military identification. Requesting access to patient Ryan Odell, room 412. Not Pharaoh's team. Pharaoh's team was already in the building. These were 3 new people, just arrived. And the reason the security desk had flagged it instead of just logging, it was because when they'd run the identification through the standard visitor verification protocol, one of the 3 names had triggered an automatic cross-reference alert to the hospital's liaison with the DoD Patient Privacy Office. She read the name on the alert, Colonel Corbin Hask. She read the name a second time, not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because the mind does that with information it recognizes as a turning point, pauses, confirms, adjusts to the new weight of things. Corbin Hask was in this building. She moved before she finished the thought. The stairwell was faster than the elevator when you needed to go down, and she needed to go down to the security desk, and she needed to get there before whoever was staffing it made a decision about those 3 visitors based on incomplete information. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her tote bag across her body, her phone already open to Pharaoh's number. Pharaoh picked up on the first ring. Hask is at the front entrance, Mara said. 2 others with him. They're requesting access to Odell. A pause of exactly 1 second. I'm moving. Don't come to the entrance. Stay with Odell. Lock the room, get your guard inside, and do not let anyone in until I tell you otherwise. Mara, I'll handle the entrance. She hit the ground floor and came out of the stairwell door at speed, which made the woman at the administrative desk near the stairwell look up with the startled expression of someone whose morning had been quiet. Mara didn't slow down. The security desk at Harlow General's main entrance was a curved counter staffed by 2 people during day hours. Marcus Fell, a former county sheriff's deputy who was 63 and took the work seriously, and a rotating position that on Thursdays was occupied by a 24-year-old named Grady, who was fine but had been in the role for 7 weeks and didn't yet know which problems to escalate and which to handle himself. She'd learned this about the desk over 3 years of passing it twice per shift, which was the kind of ambient knowledge that accumulated without intention and occasionally became useful. She came around the corner into the main lobby and saw them. Hask was easy to identify because she'd spent 18 months under his command structure, and the body holds recognition in ways the mind doesn't always have language for. He was in civilian clothes, all three of them were, which told her something about the nature of this visit. But the posture was military in the way that doesn't wash off. He was 54, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that read as authority in photographs, and as something harder in person. The two men with him were younger, mid-30s, and they were doing the same careful room scanning she'd seen from Pharaoh's tactical personnel the night before, except Pharaoh's people had been open about what they were. These three were performing casualness. She walked up to the security desk and stood beside Marcus, close enough to be clearly present, but not so close that she was crowding him. Hask saw her. Something moved through his expression, very fast, and resolved into blankness. The blankness was more informative than whatever the initial reaction had been. "Ms. Voss." His voice was the same as she remembered, controlled, measured, with the specific cadence of someone who had learned long ago that tone was a form of authority. "I didn't know you were stationed here." "I work here," she said. "Or I did. I'm on administrative leave as of today." A small pause. "I'm sorry to hear that." "I'm sure you are." She turned to Marcus. "These visitors are here to see a patient in a restricted room. The patient is under a military privacy protocol that requires authorization from the patient's commanding officer before non-medical visitors can be admitted." She looked back at Hask. "Do you have that authorization?" Hask's jaw shifted slightly. The movement was small and she would have missed it 10 years ago. She didn't miss it now. "I have military identification. The patient is a service member under..." "The patient is a hospitalized individual with privacy rights under both HIPAA and DoD Medical Protocol 4715-C, which specifies that visitor access to patients flagged under that protocol requires written authorization from the patient's assigned command officer." She said it the way you say things you've had time to look up, which she had. She'd spent 4 minutes in the stairwell, which was enough. "Colonel Pharaoh is the patient's assigned command officer. She's in the building. I can have her contacted." The two men with Hask exchanged a look that they controlled well, but not perfectly. "That won't be necessary," Hask said. "We're not here to disrupt anyone's care." "I didn't suggest you were. I'm asking whether you have authorization from Colonel Pharaoh." "We'd like to speak with the patient directly." "That's not an answer to the question I asked." The lobby was doing what lobbies do in the middle of the day. People moving through it, a family near the information desk, a food services employee with a cart heading toward the elevator. None of them were paying attention to this specific conversation, and Mara was aware of that in both directions. Nobody was watching, which meant this moment had no immediate witnesses, but it also meant Hask had no audience to perform reasonableness for. "Mara." He used her first name, and the shift in register was deliberate, the move of someone who wants to reframe the dynamic as personal and familiar. "This isn't adversarial. I'm here because Ryan Odell is a member of my extended command network, and I was informed of his injury. I'd like to see how he's doing." "Who informed you?" A brief pause. "I have contacts across the service." "So you're here as a personal visitor, not in any official capacity?" "That's right." "Then you'll need the patient's consent for a visit, same as any personal visitor. I can have that request passed to the floor." She looked at Marcus. "Standard visitor consent form?" Marcus, who had spent 3 years watching Mara navigate the desk with the precise efficiency of someone who always knew exactly what the protocol said, pulled a form from the drawer with the expression of a man who was very glad this was not his problem to solve, and who trusted the person solving it. Hask looked at the form. He looked at Mara. Something behind his eyes was doing a calculation that she couldn't fully read, but she could read its edges. He'd come here expecting a hospital, a patient in a bed, a chain of access that would be straightforward to move through. He had not come here expecting her, or expecting that she would be standing at the entrance with a working knowledge of visitor protocol and nothing to lose by using it. He'd spent 3 years assuming she was gone. People made mistakes when they stopped tracking things they thought were finished. "I'll leave the form," he said, "for when he's feeling up to visitors." He took the form. He put it in his jacket pocket without filling it out. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is choosing to withdraw from a position while framing it as a choice rather than a retreat, which was a skill, and she recognized it. And then he turned and walked back toward the main entrance. The two men went with him. She watched them go through the glass. They got into a dark sedan that had been parked in the 10-minute loading zone. It didn't leave immediately, which was information. "You want me to log that?" Marcus said. "Log all three names from their identification, the vehicle plate if you can read it, and the timestamp of the visit. Flag it in the system as a restricted patient inquiry." She watched the sedan. "And call me if they come back. My cell, not the staff line." "You're on leave." "Yes," she said. "Call me anyway." She walked back to the stairwell and went up to the 4th floor and knocked once on Odell's door before opening it. Farrow was standing in the middle of the room. The guard was inside, positioned near the window, which was correct. Odell was awake and sitting up slightly more than was probably advisable, which she addressed with a look, and he subsided. "They're gone," she said. "For now. The sedan is still outside." "He came himself," Farrow said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite disbelief but lived in the same neighborhood. "He drove out here personally." "Or was driven," Mara said. "The two men with him weren't drivers, they were something else." "He's escalating." "He's panicking, there's a difference." She set her tote bag on the chair. "Panicking people make mistakes they wouldn't make if they were escalating strategically. He showed up here in civilian clothes with no authorization and asked for access to a patient he has no formal relationship with. If this goes into any record, it went into the hospital's visitor log the moment he showed his identification at the desk," Farrow said. "Exactly." Odell looked between them. "He knows I have something." "He suspects," Mara said. "If he knew specifically what you had and where it was, he wouldn't have come here with a visitor form. He'd have come with something that looked more official." She paused. "Which means the window on the informal approach just closed. His next move will be official, and it'll be faster." Farrow's phone had been in her hand since Mara came in. "Brissette." "Yes." "I'll reach him in the next 2 hours. The JAG office I identified has a direct intake channel for exactly this category of complaint. It bypasses the standard chain at 3 levels." Farrow was already moving toward the door. "I'll make the call from outside. Signal's better." She left. The room was quieter with Farrow out of it. The monitoring equipment maintained its rhythm, steady and indifferent, and outside the window Raleigh continued its afternoon. "He's scared," Odell said. Mara was at the window, looking at the loading zone. The dark sedan was still there. "Yes." "Scared people do things that are harder to predict than people who are just dangerous." "I know." She turned from the window. "Tell me about the unit connection, the mutual service contact he used to reach you 8 months ago. Walk me through what you know about how that chain works." He talked for 20 minutes, carefully, with the economical precision of someone who had organized information in his head a long time and knew which pieces connected to which. She listened without writing anything down, because writing it down created a document, and she wasn't ready for documents yet. She was still building the architecture, and you built architecture in your head before you put it on paper. The mutual service contact was a man named Orrin Bast, a retired warrant officer who did contracting work for 3 different defense-adjacent firms, and who had the kind of social relationships across the veteran community that made him useful to people who needed things passed without fingerprints. He wasn't complicit in the Kessler Station cover-up. He was a conduit, someone who passed a message without necessarily knowing the full weight of what he was carrying. Hask used people like that. It was the specific intelligence of someone who had learned to operate through layers, never directly, never with his own hands on anything that could be traced, always with a buffer of deniability between himself and the action. The IED was different. That was the thought that had been sitting at the back of Mara's mind since Odell told her about the approach 8 months ago. The approach was clean, Hask style, indirect, pressured, deniable. But the IED wasn't clean. IEDs didn't happen to people by coincidence when they were carrying classified documents that implicated a senior officer. "Ryan," she said, "the mission you were on when you were hit, who authorized it?" He was quiet for a moment. "It was a joint task clearance. 3 signatures. Was Hask one of them?" A longer pause. He's not in my direct command chain. He wouldn't typically be one of the... Was he one of them? Odell looked at the ceiling, the specific look of someone checking something they already know against something they hadn't previously connected. The mission was flagged as priority intel retrieval. There was a supplemental authorization added 4 days before insertion. I didn't think about it at the time because supplemental authorizations happen. They're administrative. He stopped. I didn't read the signature. Can you access the mission authorization file? Not from here. Pharaoh might have it. Get her when she comes back. Mara picked up her phone. Terrell Wade's secure call was in 40 minutes. If Hask's signature is on that authorization, the IED isn't a coincidence. It's attempted destruction of evidence. The weight of that sat in the room. That's a significant charge, Odell said. It is, she said. It's also what the pattern looks like. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus at the security desk. Sedan left. 3 minutes ago. Wanted you to know. She read it and put the phone down. Good. And also not good, because where Hask went from here mattered more than where he'd been. Pharaoh came back at 3:47. Her expression had the specific quality of someone who had made a call that went better than they'd hoped and was working out what that meant for the next several moves. Brissette is ready, she said. The JAG office received a preliminary notice 40 minutes ago. They're standing by for the documentation package. How secure is the intake channel? It routes through a classified communication system that Hask has no oversight relationship with. It's not bulletproof, but it's the cleanest path we have. We need to transmit the documents from Ryan's phone tonight, Mara said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. He needs rest. He needs to not be the only person holding those files. Right now, the documents exist on 3 devices. Ryan's phone, Brissette's copy, and whatever Brissette transmitted to the JAG office in the preliminary notice. That's not enough redundancy if someone decides the physical devices are the solution. She watched Pharaoh take that in. Tonight, before Hask figures out his next official move. Pharaoh nodded. And I need to know if Hask's signature appears on Odell's mission authorization. Can you pull the file? Pharaoh's expression shifted. Not surprise. Something more complicated than that. The look of someone who has been holding a piece of information and is now being asked for it directly. Pharaoh. I pulled it 2 hours ago, Pharaoh said. When you told me he was at the entrance, I pulled every file I could access that connected his name to Ryan's unit in the last 18 months. And his signature is on the supplemental authorization, dated 4 days before insertion, as Ryan said. The stated reason for the authorization is... She paused. Intelligence coordination support, which means nothing and everything, which means he had standing to know the mission timeline, the insertion point, the route. Pharaoh's voice was even, but it was the evenness of someone keeping something contained. If someone wanted to place an IED on that route, that authorization would have given them everything they needed to know where and when. Odell hadn't moved. His face was doing something complex and careful, the expression of a man processing a thing he'd suspected but not confirmed. And confirmation is different from suspicion in the way that a door closing is different from a door closed. The action and the fact of the action are not the same experience. He tried to kill me, Odell said. It wasn't a question. Nobody answered immediately because the word tried was doing a lot of work in that sentence. And what it meant was that Hask had looked at the situation and determined that the simplest solution to a documentation problem was the oldest solution, and that Ryan Odell was still alive only because the IED placement had been based on a timing estimate that was off by 6 minutes. 6 minutes! Mara thought about that for a moment and then put it away because there wasn't anything productive to do with it right now. Terrell Wade calls in 22 minutes, she said. I need somewhere private. The floor nurse's break room was empty at this hour. Mara sat in the chair by the window with her phone on the table and waited. At 4:09, a call came in from a number that showed only a string of zeros. Wade, said the voice on the other end. It's Mara. I know, talk to me. She talked for 9 minutes. She gave him the structure of it. Kessler Station, the altered documents, Hask's promotion timeline, the visitor today, the mission authorization. and she gave it in the compressed, sequential way that people who've worked in operational environments communicate, front-loading the most critical information, leaving interpretation to the other end. Wade was quiet for most of it. He asked 2 questions. They were the right 2 questions. When she finished, he said, "You need 2 things. A record of today's visit that can't be altered or buried, and an independent legal authority that can receive the documentation package and has standing to act on it outside the normal chain." "I have the visitor log from the hospital. Marcus logged the names." "That's a hospital record. It can be subpoenaed, but it can also be challenged. You need something with more institutional permanence." The JAG office Farrow identified. "I know that office. It's clean, but it's still military law. What you want alongside it is a congressional oversight contact." He paused. "You want this to be a military proceeding and a congressional record simultaneously. That's the only configuration that prevents it from being managed quietly by someone with enough rank to move it." She hadn't thought about the congressional piece. She should have. "Do you have a contact?" she said. "I have 2. One I trust more than the other. I'll reach out tonight and give them the preliminary framework. They'll want the documentation by end of business tomorrow. We're transmitting the documentation package tonight." "Better." She heard him shift on the other end. "Mara, Hask's showing up at that hospital personally. That's not calm, controlled behavior. He's moving fast because something spooked him." "What would spook him?" "Something in the promotion process? A flag? A question someone asked that he didn't expect?" A pause. "Or someone he thought was neutralized who turned out not to be." She thought about Odell, the IED, the 6 minutes. "How fast can the congressional contact move?" she said. "If I call tonight, they can have a formal inquiry opened by Friday morning. That puts Hask's promotion on hold automatically. Any active promotion process gets paused when a congressional inquiry is opened against a named officer." Friday was 2 days away. "Make the call tonight," she said. "Already planning to." A brief pause. "You all right?" The break room was small. A table, a microwave, a bulletin board with staff schedules pinned to it. Out the window, Raleigh's mid-afternoon light was going gold and flat across the low buildings. "I'm on administrative leave," she said. "That's not what I asked." She thought about how to answer that honestly and efficiently, which was how Wade preferred things. "I'm functional. I'm moving forward. I'll feel something about all of it later when there's time." That's about what I expected. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite warmth, but adjacent to it. "I'll call you tomorrow. The zeros number." He ended the call. She sat in the break room for 3 minutes after. She wasn't thinking. She was letting her nervous system catch up with the last 16 hours, which was a discipline she'd learned in the field because pushing through without doing it created compounding errors in judgment. 3 minutes. Then she stood up and she went back to Odell's room. The documentation package was transmitted at 6:22 p.m., with Farrow managing the secure channel and Odell authenticating each file from his phone with his thumbprint, working slowly because the chest made certain positions painful and they'd had to adjust twice for the IV line. It wasn't seamless. The second batch of files had a transmission error that required Farrow to restart the channel, which added 11 minutes and elevated everyone's blood pressure measurably. It worked. The confirmation came back from the JAG intake system at 6:41. Mara looked at the confirmation code on Farrow's screen, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt the weight of it differently than she had all day. Not lighter, just differently balanced, the way a load settles when you finally set it down on something solid. "It's received," Farrow said. "It's received," Mara agreed. "It's not over." No. It wasn't. The documents were in. The congressional contact was in motion. Hask was somewhere in Raleigh or on his way out of it, and he would know by tomorrow morning at the latest that the inquiry had been opened, because people with his connections always found out faster than the timeline suggested they should. What happened between now and Friday depended on how much he knew and how he reacted to knowing it, and she had spent the last 3 years underestimating how much energy a person with something to hide could bring to hiding it. She went home at 8 p.m. She ate something she didn't taste. She sat on the couch. She thought about the photograph on the bookshelf, turned away from the room. She got up and turned it around. 12 people. The image was 3 years old, taken at a forward operating base before the Kessler Station insertion, before everything. She found Devin Waller's face in the back row, 24 years old in the photograph. His name had been written in the altered after-action report and given a false authorization he never made. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Her phone buzzed at 10:47 p.m. Not Wade, not Farrow. An unknown number, local area code. She answered. Silence for a moment. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, low, with the specific kind of flat affect that meant the person speaking was reading from something or being very careful about what they said. Dr. Whitmore, the voice said. Her old name. Not Voss. Whitmore, her name before she came to Raleigh, before she became a nurse on the night shift, before all of it. Colonel Hask would like you to know, the voice continued, that the documentation your associate transmitted tonight has a chain of custody problem that will be identified in any formal proceeding. He would also like you to know that the congressional contact you reached out to this evening has a service history that includes a professional relationship with Hask's predecessor command, which creates a conflict of interest question. She sat very still. He would like to propose a conversation, the voice said. Tomorrow morning, without the colonel present. He understands that might be difficult. A representative. To discuss a resolution that works for everyone involved. She said nothing. Dr. Whitmore, the voice said. He knows everything that was transmitted tonight. He knows the JAG office. He knows about Wade. He wants you to understand that. A pause. The offer of a conversation is genuine. She looked at the photograph on the shelf. Tell him, she said, that I'll be in touch. She ended the call. Then she sat there in the dark of her apartment and thought very carefully, because Hask, knowing about the transmission tonight, meant one of three things. The JAG channel had been compromised, the congressional contact had been compromised, or there was a fourth person who knew about the transmission who she had not accounted for, and that fourth person had made a phone call. She went through the room mentally. Farrow, Odell, the guard. Brissette in Japan. Terrell Wade. She went through it again, and the second time through she landed on something she'd moved past too quickly the first time. Fiona Lau, who had known about the military personnel, who had called Mara at home to tell her about the administrative meeting, who had been watching the OR through the observation window, and who had access to the patient floor and the room number and the general shape of everything that had happened in this hospital in the last 18 hours. Fiona, who had been kind and perceptive, and who had given Mara information at exactly the moments it was most useful. Fiona, who had known Mara was on leave before Mara had told anyone outside the administrative meeting. She picked up her phone and called Farrow. Check your guard, she said when Farrow answered. And then check everyone who knew the transmission was happening tonight, starting with Fiona Lau. Farrow called back in 14 minutes. 14 minutes was long enough to tell Mara something had needed to be confirmed before it could be said, which was itself a kind of answer. Fiona Lau was in the building until 9:30 tonight, Farrow said. She had no clinical reason to be there after her shift ended at 6. The floor nurse on Odell's corridor logged a visitor check at 8:47. A woman matching Fiona's description who said she was checking on a post-surgical patient. The guard wasn't at the door at that moment because I'd pulled him inside for the transmission. Mara sat with that for a moment. She didn't need to be inside the room, Mara said. She just needed to confirm the transmission was happening. How would she know about the transmission specifically? She might not have. She might have called someone and said there was activity on the floor tonight, people going in and out of the room, and whoever she called drew their own conclusions. Mara paused. Or she's been reporting since last night, since the OR. Why would Fiona Lau be reporting to Hask? It wasn't a naive question. Farrow was thinking out loud, working the problem. Mara did the same. She wouldn't be reporting to Hask directly. Nobody in this chain reports to Hask directly. That's how he's operated for 15 years. She stood and went to the window. But she might be connected to someone in his network without knowing the full picture. She might be reporting to someone she thinks is running a routine welfare check on a military patient, someone who told her it was administrative and asked her to keep them informed. She watched the empty street below. That's the thing about the way Hask builds networks. Most people in them don't know they're in them. That doesn't make them less useful to him. No, it doesn't. Farrow was quiet for a moment. Do we approach her? Not tonight. Tonight she's told them what she knows, and whatever she knows is already with whoever she told it to. Approaching her now changes her behavior and tips them off that we've identified the leak. Mara turned from the window. Tomorrow. After Wade's congressional contact opens the inquiry. Once the inquiry is formally open, anything Hask does to interfere with it becomes obstruction, and obstruction is a much cleaner charge to prosecute than the underlying cover-up. You want to use the window. The window between when the inquiry opens and when Hask finds out it's open. That's where we move. She heard Pharaoh breathe in slowly, the breath of someone recalibrating a timeline they'd already recalibrated twice. You've done this before. Threat assessment in a hostile environment, Mara said. You learn to think in windows. She ended the call at 11:24 p.m. and went to bed because exhaustion was itself a tactical problem and she needed to be functional by morning. She slept the way she'd learned to sleep in the field, not deeply, but efficiently, the body taking what it needed without demanding more. She was awake at 5:40 without an alarm, which was the same time she always woke, because the body keeps its own schedules regardless of circumstance. She made tea. She drank it this time. Wade called at 7:15. It's open, he said. As of 6:50 this morning, Congressman Aldrich Poole's office, Armed Services Oversight Subcommittee. They received the documentation package, they reviewed what Pharaoh transmitted last night, and they found enough in the preliminary review to open a formal inquiry into the Kessler Station after-action reporting and the promotion process for Colonel Corbin Hask. A brief pause. The promotion is frozen. She set the tea down. How official is the freeze? It's a congressional hold. It will appear in the DoD system within the hour. Hask will know by 9 a.m. at the latest, regardless of who tells him or doesn't. And the inquiry itself? Protected. The subcommittee's jurisdiction supersedes any internal military chain that might otherwise have standing to intervene. Nobody in Hask's command network can touch the process. Another pause, and this one had a different quality to it, the pause of someone who is about to say something they've been sitting on. Mara, Poole's office found something in the preliminary review that we didn't put there. She waited. The chain of custody problem Hask mentioned last night, the thing his representative said would invalidate the documents in a formal proceeding. Poole's legal team looked at it. The argument is that the photographs Ryan took weren't taken by an authorized document custodian, which creates an admissibility question. I know, I've been thinking about that. What you might not know is that the original files still exist. The altered versions are in the formal military archive, but the originals were never properly purged because the system that was supposed to delete them had a redundancy backup that Hask's people didn't account for. The originals are sitting in a DoD archive server. She went still. Can they be retrieved? Poole's office issued a preservation order at 7:02 this morning. The files are locked. Nobody can touch them. His voice had something in it now that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close enough. The photographs Ryan took aren't the only evidence anymore. They're corroboration. She sat down on the couch. The thing about spending 3 years believing you were responsible for something that destroyed people, not responsible in the vague, peripheral way of someone who was nearby when things went wrong, but responsible in the specific center of it way that Mara had believed about Kessler Station, was that when the architecture of that belief started to give way, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the ground shifting. It felt like discovering that the floor you'd been standing on had a different foundation than the one you'd been told about, and you weren't sure yet whether the new foundation was solid or whether you were just falling in a different direction. The originals, she said. They'll show the flag, the intelligence warning. They'll show everything, the flag, the risk assessment, the sign-off. A pause. His sign-off. Not Waller's. Devin Waller, 24 years old, 3 sisters. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. Thank you, Terrell. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when it's a conviction. But his voice was warm when he said it. Watch your phone today. She was in her car and on her way back to Harlow General by 8:20. She wasn't on shift. She was on leave, which meant she had no official standing in that building today. But Odell was there, and Pharaoh was there. And what happened in the next few hours was going to happen in that building whether or not she was standing in it, and she'd made a decision somewhere around 6 a.m. that she was done watching things happen from a distance. She was 3 blocks from the hospital when Farrow called. "He's here," Farrow said. "Hask." With 4 people this time and a JAG representative. "He has a document. I don't know what's in it, but the security desk called me because he's presenting it as an official basis for access to the patient." "Is it valid?" "I don't know yet. Marcus is stalling." Marcus Fell, former county sheriff's deputy, 63 years old, setting his personal watch by people's footsteps. She could have kissed him. "I'm 2 minutes out," she said. She parked in a fire lane and walked fast through the main entrance and saw them immediately. Hask and 4 others near the security desk, and Marcus with his reading glasses on, studying a document with the particular focused slowness of a man who has decided this document requires a great deal of studying. The JAG representative was a young officer in full uniform, standing slightly apart from the others with the expression of someone who has been handed a task they don't fully understand and is hoping it resolves quickly. Hask saw her come through the door. This time, his expression didn't resolve into blankness. This time, it did something more complicated. A rapid sequence of readings, threat assessment, calculation, and for a moment she could see the machinery of how he operated, the constant evaluation of every room for leverage and angles and exit positions, and she recognized it because she'd been trained by the same institution and the same brutal education of consequence. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, loud enough that the people nearby could hear it, using the name again, deliberately. She stopped 6 feet away. "It's Voss. It's been Voss for 3 years." "Of course." His voice was measured. Everything about him was measured. "We should speak privately." "I don't think we should, actually." The lobby was mid-morning busy now. Staff moving through, a family near the elevator, 2 orderlies with a wheelchair. All of them were doing that thing where you pretend you're not watching something while watching it. "The document I've presented gives me standing to speak with Sergeant Odell as part of an ongoing operational review. It's properly authorized." "By whom?" she said. "By the Office of the The promotion freeze was issued at 6:50 this morning," she said. "Congressional hold, Armed Services Oversight Subcommittee." She watched his face. "Any document generated from your command network after 6:50 this morning exists in the context of an active congressional inquiry into your conduct, which means presenting it here, using it to access a witness in that inquiry, is obstruction." She paused. "That's a federal charge. It doesn't matter how properly the document is authorized." The JAG representative had gone very still. Hask's jaw tightened once. "You're overreaching the scope of—" "I'm not overreaching anything." Her voice was even. She wasn't performing calm, she was calm, which was different, and the difference showed. "I'm describing the legal situation as it currently exists. You can verify it yourself. Call your office. Ask them if the hold is in the system." She held his gaze. "I'll wait." He didn't call. He didn't call because he already knew, or he'd suspected when Wade's congressional contact proved to be a connection he couldn't neutralize, or he'd been told in the last 40 minutes and had come here anyway because the specific failure mode of men like Corbin Hask was the refusal to accept that a situation had moved beyond their control. They kept applying force to problems that had already been decided, because the application of force was the only response they'd ever needed before. "This inquiry," he said, "is based on documents with a compromised chain of custody. Any legal proceeding will— The original files are under a preservation order." She said it quietly, just for him. "The ones from the DOD archive backup that your team didn't know existed. They've been locked since 7:02 this morning." A pause. "They show the intelligence flag, they show the risk assessment, and they show who signed the authorization that sent those people into Kessler Station." Something moved through his face that she hadn't seen there before. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the specific expression of someone watching a structure they built collapse inward, the walls going in the wrong direction, nothing behaving the way it should. The JAG representative stepped forward. "Colonel, I'd recommend we—" "Yes," Hask said. His voice had changed, just slightly, just enough. "We'll go." He walked out. His 4 people went with him. The JAG representative lingered for a moment, looking at Mara with an expression that was complicated and young and trying to figure out what had just happened and what his role in it was. And then he followed. Marcus pulled his reading glasses off and set the document on the counter. Was that as serious as it looked? More, she said. He nodded slowly. I'll log it. Log everything. She picked up the document and looked at it. It was officially formatted and bore a command header that would have looked authoritative to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She set it back down. And Marcus, thank you for this morning and for last night. He shrugged in the way of people who are embarrassed by gratitude they've earned. You always knew the protocol better than anyone on this floor. Figured that meant something. She went upstairs. The next 4 days were not clean. Nothing about what followed was clean because nothing involving institutional accountability ever is. There was no single moment where the gavel came down and the truth stood up and everything resolved. There was instead the particular grinding procedural work of a congressional inquiry gaining momentum, which moved in increments and reversals and long waiting periods punctuated by sudden accelerations. And through all of it, Mara sat in an apartment on administrative leave and answered calls from Farrow and Wade, and eventually from a congressional staffer named Priya Desai, who had a precise, methodical mind and who sent documents at midnight and expected responses by 7 a.m., and who was, Mara came to understand, very good at her job. On the second day, Fiona Lau came to find her. Not at the hospital. At the coffee shop 2 blocks from Mara's apartment that she went to on mornings she didn't have to be at the hospital early, which Fiona had apparently learned from some combination of staff knowledge and the fact that Raleigh was not a large city. She was already at a table when Mara arrived, with a cup of something she wasn't drinking. She looked like she hadn't slept well, which was information. Mara sat across from her and didn't say anything, because the shape of this conversation was Fiona's to set. I didn't know what it was, Fiona said. The person who contacted me. He identified himself as being from a military welfare office. He said there was a family privacy concern with the patient. He said they just needed to know if there were any unofficial visitors or unusual activity around the room. She stopped. I know how that sounds. It sounds like exactly how HASC operates, Mara said. Fiona looked at her. I should have questioned it more. Yes. I should have talked to you or Farrow before I... Yes. The bluntness of it landed. Fiona absorbed it without flinching, which Mara noted. The willingness to sit with accountability without deflecting it said something about a person. Is there going to be a problem for me legally? Mara thought about the honest answer. If you cooperate fully with the inquiry and document exactly what you were told and when and by whom, your exposure is limited. You weren't part of the cover-up. You were used as a conduit the same way other people in HASC's network were used. She paused. But you'll need to be honest about all of it, everything you reported and to whom. Priya Desai's office will contact you. Fiona nodded. She picked up her cup and put it down again without drinking. I didn't know who you were, she said, before 2 nights ago. I knew you were good. I knew Gage underestimated you, everyone could see that, but I didn't know. Nobody knew, Mara said. That was the point. She left the coffee shop and walked back to her apartment in the morning air, which was warm and slightly humid the way Raleigh got in summer, and she thought about what it cost to be invisible for 3 years. The cost wasn't just professional, it was the daily practice of making yourself smaller than you were, of knowing the answer and waiting to be asked, of watching things go slightly wrong because the person with the right information had decided that offering it wasn't worth the dismissal that would follow. She had been so certain that disappearing was protecting herself. She was only now beginning to understand what it had also cost. On the 5th day, Priya Desai called and told her the subcommittee had completed its preliminary review and was moving to formal proceedings. The original documents from the DoD archive had been authenticated. The altered versions had been forensically analyzed and the modifications identified and dated. The file access log showed HASC's authorization code at 0340 on the morning of the preliminary inquiry, exactly as Odell had said. On the 6th day, HASC was relieved of his command pending the formal inquiry. The announcement was quiet and bureaucratic in its language, the kind of military communication that says everything by saying almost nothing, but it was public in the sense that it was entered into the official record and would not be erased. On the seventh day, Reisner called Mara. She let it go to voicemail. Then she listened to it, which took 17 seconds because Reisner was not a man who used more words than he had to when the situation had made his position clear enough without them. He told her the administrative leave was lifted, that the hospital's legal review had determined her actions fell within an emergency exception clause that had always existed in the licensing framework, and that his team had simply not considered in the initial review, and that her position on the trauma floor was available whenever she was ready to return. She listened to it twice. Then she put the phone down and went to make tea, and while the water was heating, she thought about what it meant that a hospital administrator had found an emergency exception clause that had always existed once the circumstances made it necessary to find one. She thought about all the things that exist until they're inconvenient, and all the things that don't exist until someone needs them to. She went back to the hospital on day 9. She came through the side entrance at her usual time, 11 minutes early. The canvas tote bag on her shoulder with the electrical tape repair along the left seam. Hair pinned back. No coffee. Desmond was at the charge desk. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and his expression did something she didn't entirely know how to categorize: relief and recognition, and a kind of retroactive worry, as if he'd been understanding the last 9 days in a different light now and was still catching up to it. "You look the same," he said. "I am the same," she said. "No," he said. "You're not. But same is the wrong word for what I mean, so." She took the chart he handed her and went to the trauma bay and started her shift. It was a Tuesday. The first case was a man in his 50s with a construction site injury to his right hand. She assessed it, triaged it, prepped it, and handed it to the attending physician with the information they needed arranged in the order they needed it. The second case was a woman in her 30s with an allergic reaction that had progressed to mild anaphylaxis, which she identified and treated and stabilized before the physician arrived. The third case was a child, 7 years old, with a head injury from a fall, and she held his hand while they waited for imaging, and she talked to him about whatever he wanted to talk about, which turned out to be a cartoon she'd never seen, and she asked enough questions that he didn't notice how scared he was for almost 20 minutes. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The difference was that she'd spent 3 years treating it as a lesser version of something she used to be, and now she understood it was its own thing entirely, with its own demands and its own skill and its own worth that didn't need to be measured against anything she'd done before. Gage found her at the workstation between cases at noon. He stood there for a moment without speaking, which was unusual for him. She let him have the moment. "The inquiry," he said finally. "What happened to your unit?" "At Kessler Station." He stopped. "I read what I could find in the public record. I know there's more that isn't public." "There is," she said. "I don't need to know the rest." He folded his hands on the counter. "But I wanted you to know that I read what I could find because—" Another stop. Preston Gage was a man who had spent 22 years being certain, and uncertainty sat on him like an unfamiliar coat. "Because you spent 3 years in this department being treated as less than what you are. And some of that was this institution, and some of that was my specific doing. And knowing why you were here, what you were carrying, what had been done, it made the way you'd been treated more clearly wrong. Not that it wasn't already wrong," he added, with the slight stiffness of someone making sure the sentence came out correctly. "But I wanted you to know I understand more now." She looked at him for a moment. "The medication order," she said, 3 years ago, the one I corrected. "I remember. I was right. I know you were right. You told your resident I needed to remember my lane, Oig." He held her gaze. "I know. I'd like you to not do that again, to me or to anyone else on this floor." It landed with more weight than a reprimand, which was because it was more than a reprimand. It was a statement about the ongoing cost of that behavior, paid over years by people who didn't have the standing to make him account for it. He received it without deflecting. "I won't," he said. She believed him. Not completely, not with the certainty that would come only from time and evidence, but enough. "The extraction technique," she said, "from the OR. If you want to understand the mechanical theory behind it, why the approach works, what the fragmentation geometry is doing. I can walk you through it. Not today. When there's time. He looked at her. I'd like that. Good, she said, and went back to her chart. The formal proceedings against Hask began 3 weeks later, which was fast by the standard of congressional inquiries, which meant Priya Desai had done her job at the pace she'd set for herself. The charges were laid out in specific consequential language: falsification of official military records, obstruction of a preliminary inquiry, abuse of command authority in the alteration of casualty attribution, and a separate count related to the mission authorization and the IED, the latter still under investigation but flagged as a distinct matter requiring its own proceeding. The details became public incrementally, the way these things do. A press release from the subcommittee, a follow-up from a military correspondent who had clearly been briefed by someone in Desai's office, then a broader story when the specific name of Corbin Hask and the specific events of Kessler Station entered the public record for the first time. Mara read the stories on her phone during her lunch break, sitting in the break room with a sandwich she was actually eating, and she felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not satisfaction exactly, not vindication, nothing as simple as those words. It was more like the feeling of a weight that had been distributed incorrectly for so long that the body had started to compensate, and now the redistribution was happening, and it felt less like relief and more like the uncomfortable process of the body learning to stand differently. Devin Waller's name appeared in the second article. The journalist had spoken to his family, one of the 3 sisters, a woman named Greta, who lived in Louisiana and who had spent 3 years believing the falsified version of events because that was what the official record said. The article quoted her. She said she always knew something hadn't been right about the explanation they'd been given. She said it in the plain language of a person who has been gaslit by an institution they trusted and who is still angry about it, which was the Honest Register. Mara read that quote 3 times. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to the trauma bay. Odell was discharged from Harlow General on a Thursday, 21 days after arriving on a stretcher. He walked out, which was notable given what his chest had looked like 3 weeks earlier. He walked slowly and carefully, and with the specific dignity of someone who knows they shouldn't be walking yet, but is going to anyway. And he had Pharaoh on one side and a physical therapist on the other who was pretending not to be ready to intervene. Mara was at the entrance when he came through. He stopped when he saw her. She saw the calculation cross his face. What to say? How to say it? All the weight of what they had been through together 3 years ago and 21 days ago and everything in between. 6 weeks, she said. Restricted activity? No lifting, no tactical anything, nothing that puts pressure on the left chest wall. I know the discharge instructions. I know you know them. I'm saying them anyway because you have a history of interpreting restricted activity as an approximate guideline rather than a... Mara. His voice was rough and warm and tired. Thank you. She looked at him. You brought the documents, she said. You kept them for 3 years. You got on a transport when you were bleeding out because you needed them somewhere they'd be safe. She paused. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for not letting it go when it would have been easier to. He didn't argue with that. He reached out and gripped her forearm once, briefly, the way soldiers do. Not quite a handshake, more direct than that. And then he walked out into the daylight with Pharaoh and the physical therapist flanking him. She stood at the entrance for a moment after. She thought about the photograph on her bookshelf. 12 people. She'd turned it around almost 3 weeks ago now, and she'd looked at it every day since, and it was still hard, and it would probably always be hard, and she'd stopped expecting it not to be. That was the thing nobody told you about carrying something for a long time. That putting it down didn't make you lighter in the way you expected. It made you aware of all the muscles you'd built to compensate for the carrying, all the ways your posture had changed. All the habits you'd formed around the weight. You had to relearn things. You had to figure out who you were when you weren't defined by the thing you were holding. She was still figuring that out. Reisner's office sent her a formal communication 2 weeks after her return, which she read with the same careful attention she gave everything from Reisner's office. It offered her a position on a new clinical advisory committee being formed to review trauma protocols at Harlow General. A committee that would have standing to propose changes to how the hospital's trauma department operated, staffed, and trained. The communication was careful to note that the position would be appropriate for someone with her background and experience, which was a sentence that contained more acknowledgement than Reisner probably realized. She accepted. Not because it made everything right, not because an advisory committee position undid 3 years of being managed and minimized, but because it was a structure, and structures were how you change things instead of just feeling correctly aggrieved about them. The first meeting was on a Wednesday afternoon. There were 7 people around the table, including Gage and 2 other physicians and a nurse from the surgical floor and 2 administrators. She was the only one from night shift trauma. She came prepared. She had 3 specific protocol gaps documented with specific case data, 2 staffing recommendations, and a proposal for a cross-disciplinary knowledge-sharing structure that would allow clinical staff to access expertise across professional roles without the institutional hierarchy getting in the way. Gage looked at her proposal and was quiet for a moment. "This is substantial work," he said. "I've had time to think about it," she said, "and I've had 3 years of specific data to draw from." The committee chair, a physician administrator named Dr. Okafor, who had a reputation for running efficient meetings, looked at the proposal and then at Mara. "How long did this take you to put together?" "About 4 days," she said. "Most of the data was already organized. I just needed to arrange the argument." Okafor looked at the proposal again. "I'd like this distributed before the next meeting." She looked around the table. "I'd also like to discuss how we're using the expertise we already have in this building, because I suspect that Ms. Voss's situation is not unique, and that's a resource problem we should address directly." Nobody disagreed. Mara drove home after the meeting in the early evening light. She had the windows down because the air was good, the kind of late summer evening that Raleigh did occasionally, when the humidity dropped enough to remind you that the city was beautiful. She drove the 7 minutes without thinking too hard about anything. She made dinner. She ate it at the table instead of the couch, which was a small thing she'd been doing differently since everything happened, and she wasn't entirely sure why, except that it felt like the posture of someone who was staying. She was staying. Not because she hadn't been offered reasons to leave. Wade had mentioned twice that there were positions available to people with her background, positions with weight and authority, and a salary that would make the Harlow General pay scale look apologetic. She'd told him she'd think about it both times, and she had thought about it, and what she'd arrived at was this. The trauma bay on Tuesday through Saturday night was the place where she had learned, for the first time in a long time, that usefulness doesn't require a title, that the work itself was the thing, not the rank attached to it. She'd come to Harlow General to disappear. She'd stayed because it turned out the work she'd been doing was the same work she'd always done, and she'd been wrong to treat it as less. She cleaned up after dinner and sat on the couch with the photograph in her hands. She'd taken it off the shelf earlier in the week, not to put it away. It was going back on the shelf, but to hold it properly, to look at every face the way they deserved to be looked at, as people and not as evidence of her failure. 11 faces she knew. 1 she would always know differently. She looked at Devin Waller's face for a long time. 24 years old, 3 sisters. A mother in Baton Rouge who had spent 3 years with a falsified explanation and had always known something was wrong. She thought about writing to the family. She'd been sitting on that thought for 2 weeks. It was an uncomfortable thought because there was no version of that letter that gave them what they deserved, which was their person back. All a letter could do was tell them the truth from the perspective of someone who had been there, and sometimes the truth was the only thing left to offer. She would write it, not tonight, when she had the words arranged correctly. She put the photograph on the shelf, facing out. What she understood now, what 3 years of carrying the wrong weight and 3 weeks of putting it down had clarified, was that the hardest part wasn't the enemies. Corbin Hask was facing a court-martial proceeding that would strip his career down to its bones, and she was glad of that in the specific, practical way that accountability satisfied without being the point. The hardest part was the quieter thing, the accumulation of small moments where she had accepted someone else's assessment of what she was worth. The medication order, the step back in the trauma bay, the 3 years of choosing to be smaller than she was because it felt safer, because she'd already lost so much and she couldn't afford to lose more. She'd been wrong about that. Being smaller hadn't protected her. It had just meant that the damage happened on a longer timeline. The things that were actually worth protecting were the work and the people and the willingness to still be there when the moment came that needed you. Those weren't protected by disappearing. They were only protected by staying, visible and accountable, and willing to be wrong and willing to be right, and willing to stand in the gap between a man who was dying and the procedure that could save him, regardless of what your badge said your job was. She turned off the light in the living room. She had a shift tomorrow at 6 p.m. 11 minutes before 6, she would come through the side entrance with her canvas tote bag and her hair pinned back, and Desmond would look up, and she would take whatever chart he handed her and go do the work that needed doing, the same as always. And not the same at all. She had spent 3 years hiding from who she was. She was done with that. Not because everything was resolved. Some of it never would be. Some of it would sit in her the way old injuries sit, present and manageable and occasionally surprising. But because she had learned what the hiding cost, and she wasn't willing to pay it anymore. She was Dr. Mara Voss. She was a trauma nurse. She was a surgeon who had kept people alive in conditions that had no business producing survivors. She was a woman who had been wronged by an institution that was now being held to account for it. She was a colleague in progress, and someone with 3 protocol proposals, and a committee seat, and a letter she needed to write. She was, it turned out, exactly who she had always been. She'd just stopped pretending otherwise.